I'll explain in a moment why we're in Exodus. But what if God seems small and the enemy seems big? In North Korea, if the authorities discover that you're a Christian, you'll either be killed on the spot or you'll be sent to a labor camp, which is essentially the same thing. In Afghanistan, if you become a Christian, you have two choices. You either get killed or you flee abroad. I met a new Christian from another country, a country you wouldn't think of as being a kind of anti-Christian, but when he became a Christian, he'd only escaped with his life by jumping out of a window and flying to the UK. In Libya, it's so tough that if you take the number of us in this building and add a second congregation the same size, that's roughly the number of Libyan Christians in Libya, in the whole country. God seems small, and the enemy big. Now, by comparison, let's not overstate persecution in our own country. We're free to do this. My children hear about Jesus in their school. The Duke of Edinburgh had a Christian funeral and quite a few millions of people tuned in. It could be a lot worse. And yet, even here, God seems small. A major politician apologizes for going to church. And most people use God's name only as a swear word. They don't know the good news about Jesus, and we struggle to share it. What if God seems small? And what if what the Bible calls the world or the flesh or the devil seems big in our experience? Having walked through this first book of the Bible, Genesis, with you, I'm delighted now to start the second book of Exodus. We're preaching Exodus partly because it seems the logical thing to do, having preached Genesis, partly because I love it. I'm calling this series, This Is Our God. It would be a good title for any book in the Bible. It's a bit of a cheat, but it really does suit the book of Exodus because Exodus is all about God. This is our God. Obviously, we've got to apply the Bible to ourselves and our context, and we'll do that. But if I focus mainly on me, I'm in danger of sliding either one way into pride or sliding the other way into despair. And whatever we're facing, I know we're facing many things, and things perhaps I don't know as well. What we need most of all is to lift our eyes and look to God. This is our God. This great book of Exodus reveals God in three ways. Chapters 1 to 18, he's the God who rescues his people from slavery. In chapters 19 to 24, he's the God who rules his people from Mount Sinai. And in chapter 25 to the end, the less well-known chapters, but really the highlight of the book, he is the God who relates with his people in the tabernacle. Rescues, rules, relates. This is our God. But if it's all about God, where is God in today's Bible reading? He's mentioned briefly, there are two women who fear God, and it says God was kind to them. Thank you, Val, for a great kids slot. It does say that about God, but that's all it says about God in the whole Bible reading. God seems small in this chapter, almost a footnote. But the enemy seems big. And the enemy no less than Pharaoh, the great king of the superpower of Egypt. Talking of Pharaoh, just by way of introduction, it's worth a little aside about the history. Elsewhere, the Bible tells us that this happened 480 years before King Solomon built his temple. And so I take it, along with many commentators, this is in the 15th century BC. But exactly which Pharaoh this is, we're not sure. And some people worry because other ancient Egyptian documents don't mention the Exodus. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by that. The Exodus was a terribly embarrassing disaster for Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Maybe they didn't want to record it for posterity, especially since in their religion, they thought apparently that if they wrote something down, it would happen again. And yet there is plenty of evidence that people from Canaan did live in Egypt at that time, both as slaves and as some very important people in the palace. And since there's no evidence that Exodus did not happen, I'm happy to go with the evidence that it did happen, which is this ancient book here. Well, I'm happy to talk more about that if you're interested afterwards. But let's get back to our Bible reading. We've got this great big king, this Pharaoh, and he enslaves God's people. He murders their babies. He's terrifying. What to do when God seems small and the enemy seems big? The answer in our Bible reading is this: to see God at work behind the scenes, growing his kingdom. As Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Well, let's see that in the text in three ways. First, God's been growing his kingdom for a long time. God's been growing his kingdom for a long time. Look down, would you, Exodus chapter 1 and verse 14. It's Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 to 14 in this section. Look down at verse 1, please. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. This isn't the beginning of the story. God's been growing his kingdom for a long time. As I'm reading The Lord of the Rings with my son Henry at the moment, you'll know The Lord of the Rings is 3 books, but it's really only 1 book. And so the second book begins with these words. These are the opening words of the second book. It says, Aragorn sped on up the hill. It's clearly starting in the middle of a story. And so it is with Exodus. Remember, old man Jacob, also called Israel. You remember he lived in Canaan. And God made big promises to Jacob and to his dad Isaac and his granddad Abraham. God promised to give Jacob a big family, and here they are, 12 sons. God promised to bless Jacob, and he did, sending Jacob's son Joseph with the Technicolor Dreamcoat, sending him ahead to Egypt so that he'd be there to welcome Jacob's family, despite a famine, to the lush pastures of Egypt. God's keeping his promises. But God's been growing his kingdom for even longer than that. Let me read verse 6 now, and as you look at it and listen to it, see if it rings any bells. Exodus chapter 1, verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, it'd be easy to read those words and not notice God at work here. But let me now read the very first words the Bible says God said to a human being. I'm going to read it from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, and see if you can see the similarities. God said to our first ancestors, Adam and Eve, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the land. Now look back at verse 6, verse 7. The Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Exactly the same words repeated here. God's been growing his kingdom for a long time. From creation, that was God's mission. And here he is doing it. And he's not going to stop just because there's a new tyrant in town. Quite the opposite. I was driving to Pusey last week, and I saw a sign which said, I was driving along, saw a sign which said, cat's eyes removed. And I thought, well, what a barbaric place, Pusey, a cat's eyes removed. And I realized after a moment, no, that's a sign that someone's at work, that someone's repairing the roads. Cat's eyes removed. Well, now we know what we're looking for. We know the road sign now. Let's read on and look and see signs that God is at work growing his kingdom. Verse 8. Can you see verse 8? Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, The Israelites have become far too numerous for us. There it is. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies' fight against us and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, there we go, and spread. And so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. God's been growing his kingdom for a long time. Imagine the wicked slave drivers beating those poor Israelites into submission, mixing mud under the fiery sun, new cities rising out of the desert. God may look small, the king may look big, but in the maternity department of the hospital, it's overflowing with crying Hebrew babies, because God is growing his kingdom. If you've been to Barcelona, you've probably seen that famous cathedral, the Sagrada Familia. And you'll know Gaudi started building it in 1882, nearly 140 years ago, and they're still building it. It's not finished. Imagine you're in the Sagrada Familia, excuse my pronunciation, and all you see is a couple of stonemasons, maybe in the corner, just chipping away at a little tiny bit of rock. And you think to yourself, that's not very impressive, is it? Just a couple of guys, just a little rock. This bloke Gaudi hasn't done much. But look up. Look up and you'll realize someone's been at work for a very long time. If someone at the school gate laughs at Christians, or if at university you find a culture that's not tolerant of biblical ethics, or if at work you despair of having any impact for Jesus, or if your family seems hard-hearted, look up and see that God's been at work growing his kingdom for a very long time, and be encouraged. Well, God seems small and the enemy seems big, but God's been growing his kingdom for a long time, sorry, lost my place. There we go. And secondly, God's been growing it through ordinary believers. Growing his kingdom through ordinary believers. This is verses 15 to 21. The king of Egypt is getting frustrated. He's like someone trying to swat a fly. Is it just me who's an evil fly killer? Or do you try and swat a fly and you try and swat it and whoosh, it just goes off. You try and swat it again, boing. It's like it's made of titanium or something, indestructible fly. And king of Egypt, he's frustrated. He's been trying to swat these Israelites, but they just keep on multiplying. He's panicking because as hard as he tries to swat them, they're breeding like rabbits. So he works them like slaves. That will calm them down. But quite the opposite. They have only more babies. Look at verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name was Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. God is growing his kingdom through ordinary believers. But what does the king do? He swats harder. He grabs these two Hebrew midwives. Israelite Hebrew means the same thing, I think. He grabs them. Can you picture them? Shiphrah and Puah. Now, incidentally, I take it these were the kind of senior midwives. I take it for people that big, they had other midwives under them. But imagine them there, two very ordinary women, standing before this mighty superpower, standing before his, I imagine, his golden throne. There is Pharaoh with his great headdress, maybe a peacock. Did they have peacocks? Maybe a human fan, fanning him. And they must seem very small. But the king booms out, if a Hebrew woman has a baby boy, kill the boy. It was brutal. It was evil. And yet God grows his kingdom through these two very ordinary believers. Extraordinary, ordinary believers. Shiphrah and Puah have the faith to fear God more than they fear the king. Verse 17, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king had told them. That's faith. Now, fear might sound like a negative thing, mightn't it? And sometimes fear is a negative thing. But if fear of water makes me put armbands on my little girl before I drop her in the swimming pool, that fear is a good thing. If fear of fire makes me build my fire not in the middle of the carpet, but in the fireplace, that fear is a good thing. To fear that pool or that fire, in that sense, is just to have faith in it. To have faith that thing has the power to bring life or death, joy or grief. It's just to value those beautiful things above the £5 it would cost me to buy a pair of armbands. See, if like those ordinary believers, we are wise enough to choose rightly what to fear, that makes us invincible. Well, what happens next? Verse 18. Can you see verse 18? Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. I imagine the king on his feet now, furious, jabbing his finger, spitting with rage. What? But see those same words again. Increased, more numerous, families of their own. God is growing his kingdom through ordinary believers. Maybe we struggle with the midwife's explanation. It's a great story, isn't it, about Hebrew babies popping out before the midwives can get there. But it doesn't seem to be the truth. And maybe we wonder, why doesn't the author rebuke the midwives for telling porkies? Look, this book of Exodus is not first and foremost here as a book of human role models for us to copy in every way. Otherwise, I'd go and set fire to a bush in my garden and try and walk through my ponds. This book is first and foremost about God. We can have a debate about the ethics of these midwives and what they said. But the thing to learn from them is their faith. God grows his kingdom through ordinary believers. I haven't seen the new Sherlock Holmes TV series called The Irregulars. So you have to tell me afterwards if The Irregulars is any good or not. But I think The Irregulars focuses not so much on the superstars, on Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. It focuses on the gang of street kids who worked for Sherlock Holmes. Very ordinary kids, the irregulars. But through them, Holmes worked his magic. Maybe we feel ordinary compared to other people. Maybe we've tried to tell people about Jesus, but it hasn't really worked, and we're getting fewer and fewer chances. Maybe we wish we had the gifts that other people seem to have. They seem to be so talented, so just able, and so popular, maybe. Or we feel we have got some gifts, but we don't really have opportunity to use them, and we're frustrated. Friends, I've told you before about a Christian called Peter, who had a big impact on me as a youngster. Peter was in some ways very ordinary, very shy, not trained, not down with the kids. But he worked hard. He lived simply so he could fund a gospel worker in another country. He ran a boys' Bible study group that I was in when we lived in South London. It wasn't big or glamorous or famous, but what an impact he had in that little Bible study group. Maybe we're facing a king like Pharaoh. Not an actual king, but maybe we're under pressure. And it'd be so easy to do wrong, to get out of that, to cheat, maybe to lie, or to pass on that meanness to somebody else. Maybe someone at work or in our studies or in our wider family, someone's pressurizing you to do something wrong. Or maybe the tempter is in our own hearts. Who will we fear? Who will we trust? Let's be wise to choose rightly who we trust and who we fear. What if God looks small and the enemy looks big? We've seen first God growing his kingdom. He's grown it for a long time through ordinary believers. Now, thirdly, finally, briefly, and best of all, God's growing his kingdom through a rescued baby. Through a rescued baby. Look down with you, chapter 1, verse 22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. God is growing his kingdom through a rescued baby. Swat, swat, swat. The king keeps trying. He's tried slavery. He's tried the midwives. Now he makes a public announcement. If anyone at all sees a Hebrew baby boy, you must drown him in the Nile. I hardly dare imagine the scenes. The pitiful babies, the distraught families, the traumatized Egyptians. What evil. It seems at last the king has won, until the camera zooms onto a little Hebrew home. Why are the curtains always drawn? Yes, there's a baby boy. Only the crying's getting too loud. They can't hide him anymore. What are they going to do? The neighbors are asking questions. It seems crazy, but what else can they do? Mum makes an ark. That's literally the word here, like Noah's ark. A little boat, in hope that maybe God will do a Noah, as it were, in this deathly floods. Mum can't bear to watch as the little boat floats downstream. She sends the sister to go and watch. Here again are two very ordinary heroes. Maybe you think I'm just a mum, just a dad, just a sister, just a brother. But their brave acts of faith will change everything. What's going to happen? Look at verse 5. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Swat, swat, but the fly lives on. God grows his kingdom through this rescued baby. Now, how ironic. It is the king's daughter who lifts the lid on the boat. It is the king's palace who pays the boy's mummy to nurse him until the boy is adopted into the heart of the king's family. What an own goal. It's 3-0 to God. Moses, the princess calls him. It means drawn out. As the princess drew Moses out of the water, so through Moses, God would draw his people out of that Red Sea to the promised land. Now maybe we wonder, what about all the other babies? Why doesn't God rescue them? Why doesn't God stop other atrocities that have happened since then? Why does God allow us to suffer? Not an easy question. But in the end, the answer is always Jesus. Am I right? God is growing his kingdom and bringing justice and rescue through another baby, another rescued baby, the Lord Jesus. The baby Jesus also faced a murderous king. It's in Matthew chapter 2, you remember the wise men saw the star and they told King Herod that a new king had been born. And King Herod was furious. So Herod told his soldiers to slaughter all the babies in Bethlehem. What weeping. Weeping, great mourning, mothers refusing to be comforted. But clip clop, because Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus are rescued. They escape to Egypt. And God says, out of Egypt I called my son. Jesus knows what it's like to be a refugee. A Christian in Afghanistan wrote, how we survive daily, only God knows. And God knows because he's been kind enough to dwell with us. God who rescues his people through this rescued baby. A darker day was still to come. And with this we'll close. The darkest day, when another Herod sent Jesus to the Romans to be crucified. And God in Christ, the innocent one, was willing, yes, to be crucified and to bear the wrath of God for our sin, our wrongdoing. But as Jesus went into those waters of death, as it were, God drew him out. God Mosesed him. Jesus rose again, and he will return to judge and to bring justice for all those injustices. And he will be himself the ark, to rescue for the heavenly new creation all who trust and follow him. So what if God seems small and the enemy big? Let's be encouraged, whatever it looks like. God's been growing his kingdom, growing it for a long time, growing it through ordinary believers and a rescued baby.